you very much, and welcome to all those who have joined. And I am sure others will be joining us soon. I must say that TERI's Industry Charter for Near Zero Emission Ambition 2050 has emerged as a platform for leadership and for driving actions to decarbonize industrial sectors in coordinated and integrated manner under the leadership of Mr. Mahendra Singhi and Mr. Mukandan. Thank you so much for co-chairing the executive committee of the council and initiatives that you have taken in the recent, always I'll say it's not recent past, you have always been ahead of what others are thinking. So I must acknowledge and also say that you are showing path not just to the industry, to TERI especially.
Thank you.
Especially like to thank Mr. Nitin Prasad, Chairman Shell Group of Companies, for his leadership on this joint publication on scenario sketch for transition to near zero emissions pathways. The importance of scenarios holds significance to design different options for designing technologies, innovative approaches, and policy framework to chart a low carbon development pathway. This study is crucial for Indian industry, as industry's role is pivotal in designing and implementing strategies to decarbonize various subsectors. I would like to welcome CEOs in the panels, signatories to the industry charter, Rajshri Rai from MOEFCC and Rupa Datta, Senior Economic Advisor from Department of Promotion of Industries and Internal Trade. I'll also express my gratitude to our long-term partner organization, Energy Transition Commission, We Mean Business Coalition and Children's Investment Fund Foundation. I'm happy to invite Sophie Punte, ETA, and Sirish Sinha on the panel today. Ahead of COP26 deliberations, I would like to hear from our signatory CEOs as leaders and captains of Indian industry. I invite all of you to share practitioners' perspective under the aegis of Indian Charter for Net Zero Emission by 2050. The roadmap for implementing the technologies within different industrial subsectors will be highly complementary to the Government of India's efforts and implementation of India's NDCs and India's National Hydrogen Mission. We would like to replicate this effort and strengthen our outreach and engagement with policymakers and industries. I sincerely hope that today's deliberations on scenarios for near zero emission would provide an impetus to industries to deep dive within their sectors to champion decarbonization strategies and design approaches to achieve emission reduction. I won't say that it's a luxury. I personally feel that we are left with no alternative than to move towards near zero emissions, because we are already witnessing what is happening at the global level. We are saying that extremes of temperature, precipitation, even diseases to some extent is largely because we are not having clean environment. And so therefore, it is not an option, it is must that we adopt this way. And as rightly mentioned by Mahendra ji, you said it is both, and I'm reminded of the study that TERI had done many years back, Green India 2047, and the clear-cut recommendation was that clean doesn't mean expensive. It's your attitude. So therefore, you have to move towards adopting technologies. They may be expensive in the beginning, but you also have to see the overall cost. it is not what we are incurring today. It is also the health impacts. It's your every day, like we say, Delhi is no more a city to live, and your kids are more than anything else, they are worried about their children. Are we bringing them in the clean environment? The answer is no. And should, like you talk to youngsters and they say, no, it's fine, you get everything in India, but not clean air. So should we be moving in that direction, or we have to ensure that clean air will only happen once the emissions by the industries, by the cars, everything is reduced many folds, and then only we can expect a livable cities around and something that we all need. So with these words, I'd like to thank you once again, and I look forward to the deliberations and active involvement of all of you in discussions. So thank you so much. So may I invite Mr. Mukandan for introductory remarks?
Thank you, Dr. Vibha Dhawan, for those opening remarks and inviting us for this session, very important session. You've termed it as near zero emission. I call it net zero. I think we have to get to that figure in any case. Absolutely delighted to be part of this work which TERI is doing. As you know, TERI and Tata's have had a long association. It used to be Tata Energy Research Institute, more so Tata Chemicals, because of the long association of Mr. Darbari Seth with this institution, which he so fondly loved. And I think it's delightful that TERI is doing such a human service in terms of pushing and working with industry and acting as a catalyst to move forward to net zero emission, which all of us want. I'm delighted to also share this moments with Mahindra Singhi ji, as well as with Mr. Nitin Prasad. And the reason, and we all know what has happened in the last few months, where this conversation of net zero has gone beyond what companies were doing into various domains which we never thought it would move into. Example of Shell itself in terms of what happened in the court in Europe, as well as Exxon in terms of what really happened, transpired with respect to their board, have completely changed the paradigm as we speak. And also, as you mentioned, that this year is a year of COP26, and this is a few weeks away, and we all have to move towards actually making sure that our target of net zero is achieved faster than 2050, and that's the key task we have at hand. In terms of the work which has happened in terms of moving towards net zero, certainly I think we've got a good push and impetus by Government of India in terms of India Solar Alliance. But I think we need a similar big deal, so similar deal in terms of similar push as we would normally call it towards green hydrogen, biofuels, and fundamentally making sure that we can go to bioresources towards producing the energy needs of the world. And that really will be a game changer, and a huge amount of capital allocation needs to happen. Various numbers have been spoken about. By 2030, we know that we need 2.6 trillion. And my own estimate broadly is by 2040, we need about $6.5 trillion to sort of transform this entire journey. And a lot of commitment needs to come from both public and private sector. I really am delighted to be part of this deliberation, to learn more. Certainly, we as a company have committed. And on the company-specific commitment, I'll come back when we share a bit later when the perspectives from CEOs along with other CEOs. But I'm really delighted to have all the CEOs who joined in and welcome them on behalf of the TERI's CBS Executive Committee, and thank you all for your commitment. And also thank Mr. Nitin Prasad for the collaboration and the work which has happened directly with TERI, and this will help us, the entire community at TERI, to move forward in the right direction. Thank you, and over to you, Dr. Vibha Dhawan.
Yeah, thank you. In fact, Tata Chemicals has been a big supporter, or TERI exists because of them. And I remember time spent with Mr. Darbari Seth. He was chairman of TERI, and the kind of encouragement he gave to us. And you can never forget when you share with him any new idea, a twinkle in his eye, and something that he taught us, that you can't be number two, you have to be number one all the time and have to think out of the box. So this is his centenary year. So if he was there, he would have turned 100. But yes, his thinking is 100 year ahead, I should say. So thank you, Mukundanji. May I now invite Mahinder Singhi. He is, again, I should say, a role model. You can learn all the time from him. So over to you, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Viva. First, I would like to thank TERI CBS committee, and all the charter members who are moving in the right direction so as to lead Indian industry, so as to lead net zero transition also. First, let me say, I fully echo what our leader, Mr. Mukundan, has said about the need of the time and the efforts which are required by all of us. Let me also compliment Mr. Nitin Prasad, who led us along with Dr. Ajay Mathur to create this charter so that we are always, as industry CEOs, as Indian industry people, moving towards the best for the world. I would also say that the effort which TERI CBS team has made for increasing the number of supporters, the number of signatories from 6 to maybe around 33 is a great step, showing what and how Indian industry is committed for betterment of the future. Madam and friends, it's always great honor to be with TERI and the like-minded people and to share some thoughts. You know, at the moment, with the call of UN Secretary General as well as call of the future, that what we need to contain 1.5 degree temperature, almost 65% of the global GDP has committed for net zero, and time frame is from 2040 to 2060. 2060 is China. And at the same time, various sectors of those countries who are committed for net zero are now coming out with their action plan. What would be done by that sector, whether it's a sector aluminium, whether it's steel, whether chemical, whether aviation. And at the same time, 6 governments have already come out with a law to enforce net zero transition by 2050. And there are also more than 16 countries who have come out with green procurement policies. And I'm sure when all of us meet in UN Climate Action Summit in September, when we all meet for various programs which are being done globally in October, and then ultimately all gets into merged into COP26 from 31st October to 12th of November, we all would be able to understand that how we are making future of our grandchildren secured. Now, the charter member as well as TERI has a very great and important role to play. And I would say they have also an important role to play, not only for sustainability, but also becoming leader in industry transition. Many of you must be knowing that India and Sweden has been given the responsibility to lead whole world's industry by UN on industry transition. And Dalmia Cement is also one of the 11 or 12 industry members who are working with those governments that what can be done. And in this regard, I'm sure this TERI charter members can play very, very important role so as to push this agenda for a right cause with the right speed. We have already met together a few times, have signed the charter, identified what needs to be done. Now it's time when we say that yes, this is what we had thought of, this is how we are executing, this is the support which is required from industry members, this is support required from the society, this is the support required from the government, and this is also the support required from the globe. I think it is time now to identify the real actions, real policies. In my view, we all should now sit together and identify what policies are required to create enabled situation, enabled scenario in which not only we, the leaders who have signed the charter, push those initiatives, but at the same time, we also create a big number of industry leaders who also becomes signatory to the charter, which gives confidence not only to India, but to the whole world. In my view, advocacy would play a very, very important role. And to strengthen that, we should think of what can be done in a collaborative way for pushing more energy transition, for pushing more electric mobility, for pushing more carbon sequestration or pushing more carbon capture and utilization or storage, or maybe few more ideas. And my request in this regard would be that we should also now collaborate with organizations like CII, FICCI, and maybe also the CEO forum, which has been created by MOEF, in which also there is declaration that we will be working on various initiatives, including what Mr. Mukundan has said about use of hydrogen or use of electrifying equipments, etc. So I think my first request would be, let us collaborate with few like-minded organizations and have advocacy activities, advocacy plan. And may I, for this purpose, request all our charter members that let us make a group of 3 or 5 CEOs and then who can work on it and then take the matter forward. Second, I would like to also highlight that how do we create awareness about the green product, green consumptions, green procurement policies, because this would also lead to one, pressure on the manufacturer to create green product, and at the same time pressure on the government and other agencies also to procure green product. And for that, maybe we know that some labeling policies were implemented for refrigeration part, ACs or refrigerator or few more things. So how that can be done in various other sectors so that we can talk of green procurement, green production. Another thing would be that we all know that India has taken a great lead in solar scenario, and our own Director General Dr. Ajay Mathur is heading the global solar alliance. So now, for helping the industry to create a captive solar power plant with enabled policies, so what role can be played? Similarly, there is a great time now that on electric mobility, particularly for the industry and particularly for the mining sector, how electric trucks, how electric heavy equipments, they can be used by the industry. And for that, if few leaders together can create a roadmap, that one, how we can collaborate with each other, how we can support each other. Because if we look at the members profile, you would find they are member from energy side, they are member from automobile side, they are member from chemical, all sort of members are there. Now there is a need to collaborate. So that should be done, because now it's a time that we act now. Another thing which I would like to say is that the more the number of members, more would be the stronger voice, better would be the advocacy. So how we 33 members also now take a commitment that I would like to bring in one or two more members in maybe 3 months' time or 6 months' time with the support of each other as well as support of TERI. So in my view, I think this will play a very, very important role. And I'm very happy that Energy Transition Commission, in which I am also one of the commissioners, has played very important role along with the TERI team to create a energy transition, net zero energy transition, not only for India, but globally also and a few countries also. So I'm sure today's deliberations would go a long way in ensuring that yes, we have the specific roadmap. And I wish panel discussions, very fruitful discussions, as well. I would request that whatever say recommendations are there from the panel that gets discussed, that gets forwarded with the concerned ministries also, so that some useful outputs can come. And good part is today we have very senior representative from DPIIT, from MOEF, so that would also play a very important role. And then surely the deliberations would be very, very useful. So thank you everyone, and thanks TERI for the great work. And let me, in the end, let me also pay tribute to Dr. Darbari Seth through Mr. Mukandan, who is leading Tata Group in India in a big way. Thank you.
Thank you, Mahinder ji. Thank you so much. Now, may I invite Mr. Nitin Prasad?
Thank you, Dr. Vibha, and thanks. Big thank you to TERI, and a really warm welcome to so many friends on the call. It's great to see you all of you again. It's been far too long and a particularly trying time over the last couple of months. But really lovely to see anybody, and I hope to see everybody face to face in the near future. Vibha, I honestly, I was reflecting on this session, and I fully agree with Mr. Kandan and Mr. Singhi. And it's always great to follow them, because I can always come back and say whatever they said I agree with, and that's the shortest speech I can come back and say. It's a wonderful way to align. If I may, I'll capture what they said in 2 or 3 words, and maybe build on that. What I really heard very clearly was the sense of urgency. And with the sense of urgency, the need for dates and timelines, as Mr. Mukandan said, there is a number we all need to get to, and it's 0. And so now the only question is, how fast do we get there? And I think it's time for not just as corporates to come back and answer this question, but as society, as India, as a country, we need to come back and be very clear about this. Because the more transparency we can bring to this, the more clarity it brings to all of our sectors and companies and corporates in the direction that we can come back and take. But equally, it invites partnerships and other countries to come and help us if we're clear on by when do we really want to come back and do this. So that's the first one, the sense of urgency that's there, and the need for timelines. The second one, I think, is just the approach. And I think this was captured really well by Mr. Singhi in the sense of, we're getting at a really interesting point where the need is probably very well understood for us to go forward, but the how is really challenging, and it's not trivial. There's no silver bullet for us to come back and say adopt this one technology and everything is going to work. Some of us who've been doing this for a long time, would come back and say that fundamentally, the way that we do business, the way our processes, our systems, the way we integrate new energy technologies and start to take a look at emissions, is going to have to change. And we're going to have to change this over the years and decades to come. So in the approach, I think it's really important that there are lighthouses, companies and corporates such as ourselves who become the lighthouse for the industries to come along the way. And we are able to demonstrate very clearly how this can be done, and to build confidence that this can be done in exactly the way that Mr. Singhi said, to profitably and green and sustainably. Because I also agree those things do not need to be in conflict. It is harder, but they do not need to be in conflict. So we just have to work harder to find the solution. So that's the other thing I think we have to be very clear on is to be, how do we focus on approach and become the lighthouses and the demonstration for how can it be done. The last point I wanted to come back and just raise was inequality. And it's a worry of mine that we are at risk of creating climate inequality in the way that the technology is understood, and the pace of where things are happening, and and exasperating some of the existing inequalities that may exist. I mean, we've talked about energy justice. We can even talk about climate justice in some sense, right? And really being fair and equitable in terms of how do we come back and not have the same challenges of the past, where we create a diversity or an inequality amongst on the parts of our society. So as we go forward, not only does it need to be profitable and sustainable, but it needs to be fair and equal. And that's one of the other things that we have to be very conscious about. And why I raise this in this forum is because I think we have to recognize that it's important, as Mr. Singhi said, that we bring more people on board, that we collaborate more, that we have a broader base of corporates who are here, and we're helping to bring all of them forward. And I think that's going to be incredibly important as we go forward. So with that, we will jump into some work that we've come back and done with partnership with TERI, and a big thank you to TERI for working this with us. It's been an incredibly meaningful work. I do thank you for all the compliments that all of you have paid me, but I consider myself blessed to have had wonderful partners such as yourselves to have to done this work. So it's been a great opportunity that's there. We'll be happy to come back and jointly sort of share what this starts to look like, and I look forward to a really good discussion on that. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Nitin, so much for very, very encouraging remarks. Thank you so much. So we will now start our first presentation on India. Transforming to a net zero emission scenario sketch. So I'll first invite Dr. Ritu Mathur.
Yeah. Thank you. Can you see my presentation yet?
Not. Yeah, we can see it now.
Yeah. So thank you and good afternoon. So this is the presentation of the study that we had done jointly between Shell and TERI. And this was a study which was slated out to look at what it would mean if India were to look at transforming to a net zero emission energy system and focused just on the technologies in terms of the energy sector alone, to see whether they could get to net zero. So I'll start by beginning to explain what this net zero scenario description was. And here this was designed as an ambitious scenario to examine whether adequate technological solutions exist to fully decarbonize the energy sector and to highlight the areas which do not have enough choices for full decarbonization, and therefore to also examine the level to which each of the sectors could theoretically move to zero carbon by 2050. So of course, in painting this picture, we had to use some broad assumptions. In terms of the GDP assumptions, we assumed that India would continue to have and sustain a robust economic growth till mid-century. And therefore, all the sectoral end-use demands were estimated accordingly. We do not expect the country to compromise on its growth. Apart from that, because we were trying to look at essentially trying to get to net zero by 2050, we also assumed that technologies would continue to progress. There would be cost reductions with scalability. There would be reliable supporting infrastructure, and aggressive R&D efforts could continue to be made, leading to availability of carbon neutral fuels such as advanced biofuels by this time, and that there would also be social and behavioral shifts. So there were a host of assumptions which spread along the socio-economic, behavioral sides, which we sort of disregarded, but which policy can again help to address. So we were trying to also attempt what would be the kind of stretches which would be required by government, businesses, consumers, and citizens. And at this point, we assumed that all of these could be overcome by policy, and we're looking only at the technological solutions. So in looking forward, we wanted to see what is visualized to change by 2050. And some of the things which we also narrowed down on was that there would need to be complete shifts towards the most efficient end-use devices and processes across sectors, whether this was the demand side or the supply side in the energy sector. There would need to be maximization of end-use electrification, again, because electrification per se is more efficient in terms of meeting the energy needs than direct use of energy, and also to shift to low carbon or decarbonized options in terms of sectoral shifts across the entire energy sector. Some of the key things, for example, were in the steel sector, the DRI process would need to move entirely towards hydrogen by 2050, starting from as early as 2030. We looked at an assumption where there would be no new internal combustion engines for the petrol, diesel, gas, or LPG-driven vehicles, private vehicles from 2030 onwards, and also assumed no investment in coal-based power plants after 2030. So the approach that we had used was the Markle modeling framework, which often is used to represent the energy system. This is a cost optimization framework, which can be designed to look at what if scenarios with a goal of moving to net zero by 2050. And we had a host of consultations by talking to stakeholders and experts in the energy domain to see what could be the kind of choices that were available across sectors and how early could these be tapped and moved forward with. So in trying to get an answer to visualizing whether the energy sector had enough choices or not, what we understood was that despite pushing the limits in the energy sector, some residual emissions did remain. And this was to the tune of about 1.3 billion tons of CO2 equivalent by 2050. And for this, we would need to use additional measures outside the energy sector, such as carbon sequestration measures, including additional afforestation, etc. Or we could alternatively also use CCS or CCUS to get that sequestration. The other understanding that we got was across sectors, some are easier to decarbonize, while others have greater challenges. The agriculture, commercial, and residential sectors were relatively easier to decarbonize because also they lended themselves more easily to full electrification or are already towards decarbonized options and and higher levels of electrification. The transport sector also theoretically could be pushed towards full decarbonization, but industry in particular lacked adequate technological solutions at the moment in terms of being able to fully decarbonize. So these were where we saw the main hard to abate sectors. Now, when we've been looking at decarbonization scenarios over time, in many of the deep decarbonization studies, as also this net zero scenario by 2050, the three main key elements which we need to move forward include energy efficiency, electrification of end users and processes, and a switch towards decarbonized fuels. But the net zero scenario, as being different from other deep decarbonization scenarios, also necessarily envisaged a much, much higher share of electrification, the use of hydrogen and bioenergy as key fuels that would be needed in India's move towards a net zero by 2050. So this change would need to be transformational, and the transformations would need to be both on the supply and demand sides. Much more and early action supported by infrastructure investment would also be required if we had to get to net zero by 2050. There would need to be an acceleration of clean technologies in order to significantly increase low carbon options, create a hydrogen economy, and transform towards biomass use in an increased manner. Energy efficiency, like I said, would need to improve both through improved energy as well as material efficiency. And we may need to use carbon pricing, for example, to drive change through the market as well. Additionally, of course, the energy sector by itself was largely unable to remove all the emissions from the energy sector, and you would need additional means either through natural sinks or CCUS. So just to zoom in a little bit on the results in terms of using more and cleaner electricity, what we saw that was that you would need to have massive amounts of electrification, largely dominated by solar PV and wind. So there was opportunity for electrification in almost every sector of the economy, and the power sector needs to grow extremely rapidly. 90% of the power generation from renewables will have to be from renewables by 2050, and that regional grid connectivity and grid scale electricity storage would therefore start to become very critical. So renewables deployment at this scale, as shown in this graph, would be extremely massive and would stretch even by global standards. In terms of looking at the use of hydrogen, again, the need to necessarily look at bringing in hydrogen in industry as well as transport becomes a necessity. We have to start looking at net zero by 2050. As early as 2030, we need to start looking at hydrogen being a viable option, both in industry and transport. The scenario aims for about 13% hydrogen in final energy as a fuel in both of these sectors. 3 million tons of hydrogen in the medium and heavy freight trucks on road by 2050 would be needed. And in the 2040s, hydrogen exceeds natural gas in terms of final energy. So again, an important point to note here is that while we saw natural gas come in at some points in time, till the hydrogen economy was not mature, it could spell an era of declining use of natural gas towards the end when hydrogen starts to become more commercially viable and available at scale. So something again for industry to watch out for in terms of investing in natural gas infrastructure into the future. So again, these would need to be options which would need to be carefully evaluated by industry going forward. Again, in terms of biomass, there would be a need to redefine the use of biomass as we know its use today. Largely, India is using biomass in terms of traditional, as a traditional fuel in residential cooking, etc. But this will need to transform in terms of biomass being used in industry, etc., as second and third generation biofuels if we had to move towards a net zero scenario. So here again, the shift towards fuel in industry and transport, including in the hard to abate sectors like aviation, will start becoming important. And liquid biofuels would need to surpass petroleum products by 2040 to fuel the industry and transport requirements. So again, by mid-century, we also note that unused capacity could also offer export opportunities for biofuels if India were to step up its investments and see this as a market where India could take a first mover advantage. So this is how the emissions sort of might look if we look at the line going upwards in a do nothing kind of a scenario. And we are on a trajectory of growing emissions with the kind of growth that the economy needs. But if we were to look at a net zero by 2050 kind of scenario, the path needs to be extremely different. Not only does the path need to be extremely different, but it needs to start bending the curve as early as 2025, which is just around the corner. And if we look at the light blue dark line, we see that the energy sector can bring down the emissions, but still gets left with some bit of emissions. And then the other two dotted dashed lines indicate the extents of using sequestration measures to bring the emissions down completely. So again, looking at the India energy system transformation, electrification needs to play a very important role. And as we switch from the direct use of fuels, electricity, which today is somewhere around 18% or so, will need to have a share of nearly about 50%. So that's a huge amount of electrification that we are looking at across sectors as well. In terms of fuels, we will still need to continue using some fossil fuels, and we can see the green part being natural gas, the light pink part here showing hydrogen, and the red part is the petroleum products which start to disappear after 2040, and the black part being some amount of coal which still gets continued to use in industry as direct use. So there are some of the areas where we would still need to use direct energy forms going forward. So there are some hard to abate sectors, especially in the industry sectors, which need further thinking about in terms of technology. In the transport sector, as of today, India is majorly using petroleum fuels, to some extent CNG, and to a small amount biofuels and electricity. But again, we see a very large transformation in terms of moving away from petroleum fuels, which are indicated as red or maroon bars here in the picture. And by 2040, 45, that amount becomes really minor, with a much larger role for biofuels, which are indicated in green, and the purple parts representing electricity. The pink bars here are hydrogen and some bits of bio-CNG. So we see a very big and very major transformation in the transport sector in terms of moving to a very different mix from what we know today as being the fuels of the future. We of course assume that vehicular technologies will continue to improve, but it's also the fuel choices that we need to be moving fairly quickly. Similarly, in case of the industry sector, we need to see a huge transformation in terms of bending down the use of coal, for instance, and starting to reduce it starting now, and also natural gas, which continues to sort of replace coal for some time, but also a much higher amount of electrification coming into industry to be able to move towards decarbonized sources, as well as biomass and hydrogen starting to play a role, represented by the green and pink parts of the bar here. So it's difficult to envisage complete decarbonization of India's energy sector by 2050, especially in the industry sector as of now, because some subsectors did not have adequate fuel and technology alternatives available as we know them today. In case of the power generation sector, again, we see a transformation which is going to require a huge ramp up in the amount of solar and wind in particular. And the rate of growth of electrification, again, is something which goes up very rapidly because of the switch from direct fuel use to electrification across sectors as well. So concerted efforts will need to be made towards enabling early decarbonization of India's power sector if we have to go towards this electrification route as well. So now we need to think about looking at this picture and understanding how to make progress if we had to move towards this kind of a scenario. And at this point, I would hand it over to my colleague, Subrata from Shell, to continue with the rest of the slides.
Thank you, Dr. Mathur. Am I audible?
Yes.
Wonderful. Okay, so when it transforms from primary to secondary energy and secondary to tertiary form of it, we get to understand the electrons and molecule better when we see beyond and outside the model the thing in our as we do our business or as we consume. So we will start from the explanation just Dr. Mathur has just shared with us. Let us focus on two sectors, industry and transport, because it will remain nearly 82% of the total energy demand, which is currently 75%. So while the growth in share sounds manageable, the actual energy consumed will be doubled, even in a scenario where the demand side management is more than adequate. So this and the industry sector and the transport sector forms our focus. So the industry sector will need to progress rapidly through adequate and just adoption of techno-economic policy levers in 6 key areas. If we summarize from the just a few minutes ago what Dr. Mathur said, electrification using renewable, hydrogen, energy efficiency, natural and artificial sink, and biomass. However, we understand that each subsector will have a different technology adoption and affordability challenge, especially in hard-to-abate sector. Hence, a sectoral approach in policy framing that addresses respective challenges actually will be more helpful to decarbonize these sectors. Now, if we look at the industry here, we see there is a various phase of transition happening at a various stage. So it shows, and what it doesn't directly show, each sector has a start and has an end. And we have multiple sectors and subsectors to address with their respective contribution or the demand that they actually give to the overall energy system. Next, Ritu. Yeah, so come to the next one. So if energy is the biggest one, then the transport from the demand side comes to the immediate next. And while it is manifested as output in the modeling exercise, it will have nearly 20% share of the final demand in the energy system. But this is a sector that holds the potential of complete decarbonization by just transitioning into cleaner fuel mosaic. Now, the concept of mosaic upholds the fact that there is no silver bullet, but the current mix will gradually evolve into a mix that is more cleaner, which is hydrogen, biofuel, electrics. So, two high-level policy framing approach in two of the most important demand sector that decides the final energy is basically worth reiterating. So for industry, what we see through our analysis is that a sectoral approach, and for transport, it is a mosaic approach to transition into a decarbonized future. Next, Ritu. Now, this that we just spoke is about policy framing approach. But we also, the next in these two sector is also, is most important is what is the content of the policy itself that will guide how to make the progress. So as you see here, first is it has to be just and fair to make the transition acceptable and sustainable. The next and the most important, possibly especially in India, is to create a coherent policy framework. Now, coherent policy framework will essentially give the credibility as well, and hence acceptability, and the adequate deployment. So, but also the challenging establishing the coherence also comes in a large and diverse system like that of energy system in India, comes from the basically the multilateral nature and also the multidisciplinary nature. So, for example, the same automobile sector will have the same bunch of fuel, but exactly which vehicle segment or will adopt which fuel will possibly need a clear roadmap for investment and the business to take this way forward. Now, the last bit is even more important for corporates, is that this needs to be seen as an opportunity. And when it is seen as an opportunity, then the investment and the growth will happen. And that will also help India become the climate economy that it aspires to be through investing in climate technology and transitioning it into a net zero system, energy system. Next. Okay. So we have spoken a little about coherent and credible policy framework. Let us dive a bit deeper. So what will they actually mean when from the framing approach to actually the policy or the regulatory framework, regulatory documentation is done? So drive the economy-wide change. So it cannot happen in pockets. So then only it will be credible and robust. It will accelerate the sectoral transitions, which I've just explained in case of industry, and similar thing goes into the sector and subsectors of mobility, and in a way also in the commercial and agricultural sector. So, and that will essentially establish the governance framework that will ensure the removal adequate, and it will by 2050 or such a desired timeline, it will reach the net zero. Now, this credibility and coherence and framing it and implementing it will also need a behavioral change in the end user sector, because that will depend the adequate supply and demand match, and hence what we'll see, it has to be clear and predictable also for the end user sector. It has to be fair and equitable, and also as a part of wider economic inclusion, it has to be transparent and inclusive. So with that, Ritu, the next one. Yeah, so we have gone a bit into the framing part, the framing approach, and also what these policies essentially will have to carry to give the right signal, and so that the implementation happen and the net zero transformation really takes place with a defined timeline. So what we actually observe that these few things are almost immediate to start. One, enhancing and expanding the electricity transmission system. Two, on the electricity expansion system contributed by the renewable investment. to basically make up for the huge gap that we still have as a bit of fossil and non-fuel source of electricity. Then adopting hydrogen in the energy system and bioenergy to decarbonize the hard-to-abate sector in respective proportion and technical feasibility. Develop a vibrant lower carbon manufacturing industry. And that's also supported by the carbon related policy, be it pricing, be it trading, be it tax, whichever way. And adopting them will help respective sectors to transition into a lower carbon manufacturing. The last is the sustainable development goal. And it is when that all this is embedded into the sustainable development goal of a business will transition in, that will be trickle down to the economy, and the overall energy system will achieve a net zero. I will stop my presentation here, and I think it will. I will give it back to you, Dr. Mathur. This illustration essentially holds the story together from where you are and where we move and what are the changes needed. Thank you.
So I think we'll end the presentation with that and proceed with the rest of the discussion within the panel after this. So thank you.
Thank you, Ritu. Thank you, Subrat. May I now invite Mr. R.R. Rashmi, Distinguished Fellow, TERI, and former Special Secretary and Chief Climate Negotiator, Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, to chair the panel discussion. We are running behind schedule, but we'll have you chair the comments and chair the discussion with the panelists. Mr. R.R. Rashmi.
Thank you, Arup, and thank you very much. Now, this is a difficult task. We are half an hour behind our schedule. We had 1 hour originally from 4 to 5 p.m. We have about 6 corporate leaders, 3 prospective people from philanthropies and the business coalition, and 2 government representatives. Quite a large list, but extremely important. So I would begin by requesting each panelist to be extremely economical with their time and then make their point extremely in a concise manner in about 4 to 5 minutes, so that we can stick to our overall time of about an hour. Now, before I invite the panelists, we have heard Dr. Ritu Mathur and Subrata Basu, who have laid out for you the overall scenario in terms of an emissions pathway towards net zero economy. There are 3 key issues, as they have pointed out, that you require an extremely rapid transition in terms of electrification. You require biofuels, and you require hydrogen economy. These are the 3 key essential elements. So a decarbonized electricity system, production and demand, that is the first pillar. You need bioenergy, biofuels, and you need hydrogen. The fourth pillar, the 4th key element, which I think whether you captured this or not, was that there will be residual emission at the end of this entire transition in 2050. And that residual carbon emissions is very large. And you will require either carbon capture, utilization, and storage technology for that, or you will require carbon sequestration. So this is the 4th element of this entire net zero strategy. Now, the 3 corporate leaders which you heard, Mr. Mukundan, Mr. Nitin Prasad, and Mr. Mahendra Singhi, they have all explained to you about the overall scenario, the overall goal. I mean, the why is not disputed. When is being debated? When is it possible for us to move towards begin or commence a movement towards net zero, or make or formally adopt it as a policy plank. I am not getting into that. For this session, I'll request the panelists to focus on the issue of the strategy. What is it that we need to do in each sector to be able to move towards net zero scenario, given the picture which the researchers have pointed out for you? There are obviously there will be barriers and there will be constraints. So from your perspective, from each of the corporate presenters, from your perspective, how do you see your sector going? How is it going to behave? And what are the things which you might need? I'll request you to dwell on that. So now let me begin. I don't know if Ms. Rajesh Ray has joined, or then let me request her to make her initial remarks, 4 to 5 minutes, each one of you. Rajesh, over to you.
So, Ms. Ray has still not joined. We can start
Okay,
with.
all right. So then let me invite Dr. Rupa Datta, who is the Senior Economic Advisor in the Ministry of Commerce. And of course, the Ministry of Commerce looks at the whole issue of competitiveness and productivity. So it will be important to hear her perspective on this. Rupa, we have long association. It will be good to renew our acquaintance. And over to you now.
Thank you, sir. It's always a pleasure interacting with you, and working with you in Department of Commerce brings back a lot of good memories. Sir, I would just like to make one small correction. I have now become a Senior Economic Advisor in the Department of Industrial Promotion and Internal Trade. So,
okay. So your gamut has widened. Very good.
Thank you for saying that, sir. And wishing everyone a very good afternoon. And many thanks to Sir and TERI for giving me this opportunity. But I would like to mention in the beginning that I have very recently joined this department. So by looking at all the work, what I'm trying to connect today is the Indian industry and decarbonization. Sir, as you would know, and others, that Indian industry presently, I will come to the focus areas later, are focusing on a lot of other issues, but the validity and the need for looking at decarbonization remains undeniable, and we need to keep this up as a focus area. So I would like to mention that the greenhouse gases, of which CO2 has a major share, trap heat and make the planet warmer, and human activities have been largely responsible for this. India is the third largest emitter of CO2 after China and US. And this CO2 emission in India has increased substantially from 530 MT in 1990 to 2309 MT in 2019. Electricity sector is the top CO2 generator in India, accounting for nearly half of the total CO2 emission in India. Now, linking it with Indian industry, I would like to mention that industrial sector constitutes around 28% of the total CO2 in 1990, which has reduced to 24.7% in 2018. Therefore, decarbonizing of Indian industry must be seen as a crucial step towards attaining the target of near zero emissions by 2050. The current size of our industrial sector is about 49 lakh crore, which is about 3% of the world industry output. This accounts for 24% of GDP, and this would include also industry, construction, and other activities, and provides employment to 24% of the workforce. The growth rate of this sector between the period 2012-13 to 19-20 was about 6%. It is estimated that with a higher level of industrial output, CO2 is projected to increase if carbon neutral technologies are not adopted. Iron and steel, chemicals, cement industries are some of the leading CO2 emitters in India. The CO2 emitted during industrial production are split into two categories. One are the direct emissions, which are produced at the facility, and the indirect ones, which occur off-site, but are associated with the facility's use of electricity. Now, these direct emissions are produced by burning fuel for power or heat through chemical reactions and from leaks from industrial processes and equipments. And most of them come from consumption, as we know, consumption of fossil fuels for energy. Indirect emissions are produced by burning fossil fuel at a power plant to make electricity, which is then used by an industrial facility to power industrial buildings and machinery. For developing countries, this would be from our policy perspective, sir. This remains reducing industrial emissions to net zero is a challenging task because in many cases, the financial cost of making low carbon industrial products will be higher than the carbon intensive production methods used till now. So in all cases, the costs associated with decarbonizing industry are uncertain, and there would be a lot of issues influencing them, such as fuel prices, proximity of industrial sites to shared infrastructure, cost of new equipment, etc. Government is taking a number of steps to support existing industry and encourage the growth of new low carbon sectors in India. One of the key barriers for reaching net zero, we feel, is distributing the costs of decarbonization between the taxpayer, industry, and consumer of industrial products. Because deploying of low carbon technologies will mean that the resulting low carbon products will be more expensive to manufacture and therefore needs to be supported by government fiscal interventions. So action needs to be taken for development of a market of low carbon products. And this also requires a change in perspective in the way industry looks at making of goods and producing energy. As the department representative would be here soon, so I will not mention about what the department is doing, which they are going in for many more programs in this area. And we know that Government of India has been driving a vibrant renewable energy program, which focuses on achieving energy security, energy access, and reducing carbon footprints. And this is in line with India's commitments under the 2015 Paris agreements. I would just make a few suggestions. I will not take a long time because, as you said, sir, that we are all, we have overstepped, the time limits have been overstepped. I will make a few suggestions and then I will end by saying, just focusing a few areas of this new department where I have joined. What are the critical areas, and maybe we'll have to think through how to work around these issues of decarbonization with them. From our point of view, some of the ways to reduce this industrial CO2 emission can be promoting energy efficiency in industrial production. And this requires upgradation to more efficient industrial technology, identifying new ways that incentivizes manufacturers to use less energy to light and heat factories or run equipment. We also need to switch on to lower CO2 intensive fuel, which will result in less CO2 emissions, but the same amount of energy. Government has a target of producing, I think, 175 gigawatts by 2022 and 450 gigawatts by 2030 from renewable energy. Renewable energy and non-conventional energy are very focus areas of this government, and I mean, their representatives will be better able to highlight this issue. We also need to focus from the industry point of view on the circular economy. Producing industrial products from materials that are recycled or renewable rather than producing new products for raw materials. So, for example, recycling of scrap steel and scrap aluminium as opposed to smelting new aluminium or forging new steel would be relevant. So this, because like I said, I've just joined this department, and industrial development is a key priority area here. What we need to do is, when I heard the presentations, we need to build in the environment prospect to it. I would just like to end by saying that what are our key, now as we are given the current scenario, as we are recalibrating the economy and looking at building up the growth momentum, some of the key areas which this department looks at is, for promoting manufacturing. Some of the very major areas are, one is, of course, where DPIIT is looking at developing industrial corridors. The whole idea is to develop multimodal connectivity. This is also for all the industry leaders here, so that we can just highlight our focus areas. I'll just take a few moments. is aimed at providing multimodal connectivity with complete plug-and-play infrastructure, and already development of 11 industrial corridors with 32 projects have been approved. Another key area is Make in India to facilitate investment and building best in infrastructure and making India a hub for manufacturing, design, and faster innovation. There are major sectors which are focus areas such as pharmaceuticals, textiles, etc. And we have 24 focus products such as furniture, auto components, ready-to-eat products, etc. These would, besides promoting Atmanirbhar Bharat, these are some of the areas where maybe we can think through of how, talking to industry associations, how do we promote the better decarbonization and, reduce the energy emissions and going for more energy efficient solutions. Some of the other critical areas that investment clearance cell has been set up, so that there is there's a one-stop digital platform. There are project development cells. We have again we have this production linked incentive scheme for 13 key sectors. This will help in increasing the size of key sectors. And again, here the whole idea of improved energy emissions can be worked out in areas such as electronics, pharmaceuticals, drugs, telecom, networking, food products, white goods, etc. Another key area is a one district, one product scheme, where again a lot of focus is being made. And already 106 products have been identified from 103 districts in the country. And we are looking at developing projects for 739 products from all the 739 districts. I come to another key area where we can again focus on, that is the quality control issues and adoption of technical regulations. And for this, to reduce the import surge and improve the manufacturing facilities in the country, a lot of focus is being given by all fronts. Even our Honorable Prime Minister had spoken about zero defect, zero effect issues. And DPIIT has been issuing QCOs to ensure, along with Department of Commerce, to improve, as you said, sir, productivity, competitiveness, and quality, so that our import surge is reduced and we become more competitive in the entire world. Some of the other issues I will just end now is we are looking at improving doing of business report. India has improved its track from 142nd to 63rd in 2019. The steps are being taken to reduce overall regulatory compliance burdens, and a regulatory compliance portal has been launched on 1st January. And some Startup India is again a flagship initiative. The startups can also be, be part of this initiative, and they can be motivated in using more efficient technologies. And steps are also being taken to promote, to encourage more FDI in the country. And for the year 21-22, I would like 2021, the country had registered its highest ever FDI inflow of 81.97 billion. We also have separate programs for the Northeast and project monitoring groups. With this, sir, I would come to an end. I've given a brief of the activities of DPIIT and how we can try to, mix and match the two, especially in some key areas, and see how, with this key focus area where there are a lot of ministries already working, probably we can also see how we can, integrate this and move ahead. Thank you, sir.
Thank you very much, Rupa. Once again, congratulations for taking over the senior higher position in the DPIIT. And thanks for your extremely useful overview of what the ministry is doing, what the government intends to do in the manufacturing sector. You have outlined a number of initiatives and programs that are underway, which will contribute to decarbonization and maybe lower energy consumption in terms of productivity, improving the productivity. You did refer to the issue of the costs, the higher costs resulting from decarbonization efforts, and your proposal to share the costs across the spectrum amongst the industry, the consumers, and as well as the government. So of course that's an open issue. Once the goal is adopted, naturally these will have to be put in motion. But right now itself, the number of programs which government is implementing will help contribute to this goal. Thank you very much. Let me now go over to the first panelist on the perspective side, Ms. Ita Kettleborough. She's a Deputy Director on the Energy Transitions Commission, and as you might be knowing, Energy Transitions Commission has helped a number of countries. It's a global group of corporate leaders and think tanks who are helping the countries make this transition in the field of energy sector. And she's currently based in Beijing, where she's looking at how China is conducting its managing its different initiatives. So, Kettleborough, can I request you to address it? And once again, let me emphasize the time constraint, 4 to 5 minutes, please.
Absolutely. Thank you so much. It's a real pleasure to be joining you all today. Thank you so much for the wonderful presentations we've had so far. We are very excited about this piece of work and our ongoing collaboration with TERI. We work closely with TERI on the ETC India program, exploring what it will take to drive power sector and harder to abate sector, industry sector decarbonisation. So, and we also on this call, we have a number of our ETC Commission members who've joined. So Shell Commission member, Tata, Dalmia, Cement. So really, really wonderful to be a part of this discussion. In the interest of time, I was going to say a little bit more about the ETC. Most of it's on the website if you have any questions. And I'm going to jump straight to some reflections on both the pathway and what needs to happen. So first of all, in terms of kind of how the ETC has envisaged the path or looked at the path to decarbonising the global economy by mid-century, and the ETC looks roughly at 2050 for developed countries and 2060 for developing. We have a relatively similar vision, a three-step approach. We need to first of all use less energy, so using all of those energy productivity levers, energy efficiency, material circularity, service efficiency. We then obviously have to scale up clean energy provision, so there has to be massive clean electrification, hydrogen, clean hydrogen we've heard talked about today, sustainable bioenergy, and then that CCS availability where we still need to use fossil. And then we need to make sure that we're actually using that energy in all our sectors. So the easy to abate sectors, it's all about how do we drive this mass electrification. Harder to abate sectors, it's a more complex story, as we've heard, and it's more about what is the right mix for that sector in terms of those 4 fundamental decarbonisation technologies. Clearly, local dynamics matter, and that's why these types of studies and this TERI and Shell sketch for 2050 is really so powerful, because we need to take into account local resource costs, policy conditions, different availability of those different sources. So clearly it's a very local story, but overall, I just wanted to make a few comments on each of those 4 levers. So first of all, on massive clean electrification, we're very aligned that this is the bedrock of a net zero emission economy. I think the ETC, we would potentially even have a more electricity-based vision, and we would look for are there even further opportunities to go perhaps beyond 50% of final energy demand towards 70% of final, 60 to 70% of final energy demand being met by clean electrification, both direct electrification and indirect. So thinking about obviously the hydrogen and hydrogen derived fuels. In terms of kind of what would be required to deliver that, clearly decarbonising electricity, because we've had these massive declines in wind and solar costs, and especially within India, the solar resources that are available. This is it's a lower cost story, but that doesn't mean that there aren't policy actions that can enable massive ramp up of the speed of solar build out. One of the key pieces is those quantitative targets, which India has already shown the power. India is leading the way in some of those quantitative targets for solar build. But alongside that, there's some really important questions about power market design, how the system works, that would enable and setting it up in such a way to harness investment into these new assets that need to be built to meet massive power system growth. Alongside that, there's also a need to think about the network and the planning and permitting processes. So kind of some of the structures around your actual wind and solar build out to make sure that those can kind of keep pace with the pace of build out. So on clean electrification, very much aligned, but perhaps even going further. On clean hydrogen, again, very aligned with this story that this can be one of the key decarbonisation vectors when electrification is difficult or costly. India, again, in a very good place from clean hydrogen to potentially take a kind of leadership position in the green hydrogen economy, especially leveraging those solar resources. Couple of things to be really conscious of when you're looking at driving the hydrogen economy. The first is really reflecting that it's a technology that's had a lot of hype. It's been emerging for a long time. We've heard about hydrogen coming before and it's perhaps not come. So why is it different this time? Really focusing on its role as a decarbonisation vector. But when you focus on that, you recognise that clean hydrogen and green hydrogen are in a very early stage of development and so are very high cost. So options to address those cost premiums, including industrial clusters and looking at opportunities to group industry action and common infrastructure, supporting particularly the initial technology scale up. So recognizing that we might need early additional support for the R&D around, for instance, hydrogen-based steel production routes, for example. So actually using that clean hydrogen in industry is probably going to need to require some support in the early days. And also really recognizing that the challenge for clean hydrogen, because it's a more expensive route, is ensuring that there is a market for that higher cost end product. And so using some of those policy levers to make sure, and voluntary action to make sure that the policy, that the market is there for these clean hydrogen derived products when they are developed. Very briefly, on sustainable bioresources, I think we would agree that there will be a critical role, but we would have a bit of more of a note of concern on bioresources. One of the challenges is really to make sure that those bioresources that are being used are truly sustainable and that they have low life cycle carbon. And when we really get into that, it will constrain some of the sources that are available. We've got to avoid competition with existing uses of land for food production, etc., and also for biodiversity, natural parks. You've got to make sure that you avoid triggering land use change when you use the land. You take into account carbon debt in terms of what could have happened without using it. And you also need to make sure that you try and respect the kind of biodiversity impacts that this bioresource production has. And so if we're using bioresources, we need to kind of do three things. We need to make sure that we have really good collection mechanisms put in place to gather sustainably produced bioresources, and that comes out very clearly in the report. We need to focus on the marginal land and border crops, and I know that, for instance, Dalmia is doing some really interesting work looking at border crops and how those can be used, marginal land, bringing that back into production for energy, and also thinking about other ways of freeing up land via, for instance, diet shifts or productivity improvements in agriculture. And so all of that for us brings a little bit of a note of caution of whether there will be enough bioresources and whether that actually will be quite a constrained supply. And in that case, we would argue that we shouldn't use bioenergy where there are other alternatives. So perhaps in road transport, not relying on it and using, because there's electrification and hydrogen routes that we could use, but prioritizing materials uses, the aviation sector, as was already flagged, and also those industrial energy uses, which can be combined with CCS, so you can also get negative emissions. Finally, on CCS, very quick note, here we would agree that this is going to be a really critical part of the overall story where we have to use fossil sources and add that CCS. I think the key flag and caution here in terms of really making sure that we can start to grow the CCS economy or the CCS scale of CCS is that while theoretically we know there's a lot of storage, we don't actually have a lot of data in some countries, particularly in India, on what's really available and the commercials of that. So really a really important kind of near-term action of ensuring some of that exploration goes forward so that we can identify the sites that can be used to support CCS. I will pause there and hand back. Thank you again for a wonderful presentation.
Thank you, Ita. Thank you very much for being brief with your presentation, and you have made your points very clearly. And I appreciate the fact that you have cautioned about the use of bioenergy as one of the possible routes to net zero emission scenario. You have emphasized green electrification and green hydrogen as the two clearly viable routes without any adverse impact on the environment. Thank you. And you have also warned about the CCS route, where some more research is required. Thank you. And let me now go over to Ms. Sophie Ponte. She is the managing director of the policy of We Mean Business, one of the largest business coalitions in the world. And let us get her perspective. Obviously, it will be a global one as to how the net zero scenario will play out in India. Over to you, Sophie.
Thank you very much, Dr. Rashmi, and for TERI for inviting me to this event. So We Mean Business is a coalition of 7 partners, including CDP, World Business Council, Climate Group, and several others. And then we have a number of local partners. And for India, TERI is an important one. And for other initiatives, we also work, for example, with ETC. And our role is to really look at how can we use forward-looking companies that are taking leadership on climate change and use their voice then to build confidence amongst policymakers to make policy more ambitious. And so I wanted to explain the international perspective from what are the 4 stakeholder groups that are really going to drive decarbonization in India. And the reason is that India cannot do it without the rest of the world, and the world cannot do it without India. So we need each other. The 4 types are business, government, investors, and civil society. So to start with, heavy industry and transport are very much international sectors because they're part of international supply chains. So from a business perspective, India is a big exporter of cement and steel. Multinationals have also got operations in India, and their logistics supply chain is part of an international one. And what that means is that many of those corporations, and we're hitting about 2,000 now, who are committing to science-based targets, are also looking to decarbonize in the sectors where their operations are or where they import products from, and that includes India. So one big pressure will come from international companies that are looking to make India part of their decarbonization efforts. And as a result, India has an opportunity to leverage those customers of industry, of freight, to see can they help decarbonize by helping with technology, with the implementation, but also by funding. Second one is then the government. So the governments are, as you know, India is part of the international government community. The G7 meeting was held last June that also invited India to come to the table. And there you saw, for example, for the first time, that zero emission vehicles were being mentioned, and there was a discussion on the ending of internal combustion engines. There was also a discussion on a commitment to end international coal financing that is unabated, so that is not accompanied by carbon capture storage. And that means that the access to finance for countries, including India, by international investors is also going to go down. Fossil fuel subsidies commitments to end those by 2025 and unlock that money to invest in renewable energy and elsewhere. Plus, they were looking at 100 billion commitments. And although there's not all of that is on the table, there is, of course, a reliance from countries like India and elsewhere that the more advanced economies are going to financially support the transition to decarbonize. One of the persons in the chat talked about carbon credits, and there's a mention of potential of carbon pricing in combination with voluntary markets and emissions trading. And so what we see is that at the G7, that leadership position was taken, and that then goes to a G20 summit, which is end of October, and subsequently to the COP. Now, at the COP, Article 6, which is all about financing, is going to be a key area for negotiation and influencing. And I think it would be really good to have clarity on the roles of the various financing mechanisms that will be important to India. But the one that I wanted to mention that is important with business is insetting. So instead of offsetting, like planting trees or buying renewable energy credits, more and more companies are looking to see, can we invest money to help our own supply chain decarbonize? So take, for example, a company like DHL that has subcontracted freight in India to help finance transition of those subcontracted carriers to, for example, electric trucks. And that is an area that I think you can leverage a lot from. Moving on to investors, right? We now see that investors are shying away from investing in coal-fired power plants, and that will play an important role for many countries that are still relying on coal. But they're also, in combination to that, asking the companies they invest in to disclose their exposure to climate risks. And that again will fuel more investment going to companies that have a good plan to decarbonize. Now, the final group is civil society. There, I think it would be unwise to underestimate the influence of civil society on this whole debate. And we're seeing, for example, a pushback on the term net zero. Now, I think that as a realist, you have to accept that if you cannot fully decarbonize by reducing emission in itself, you need to offset or compensate part of it. But it also depends how much, what a percentage are you going to allow for reducing outside your own supply chain. So yesterday, Oxfam came out with a report, and they calculated that if the entire energy sector would be having net zero targets as currently set by many energy companies, we would need the whole Amazon as an area to plant forests, which is about 1/3 of all the global farmland. So obviously it's part of the equation, just don't over rely on it, because then you get the other problem of competition with farm and thus food. The other point that they're pushing forward is circularity. If you look at industry, they're responsible for 27% of global emissions. 15 to 25% of the steel worldwide is not yet recycled. 92% of the concrete is not yet recycled. And without the recycling and bringing steel and concrete and other materials back into the system, we're not going to meet our emission reduction targets. So that will have to be part of the plan as well. And the final one is then really about equity. We all know the discussion around vaccination equity, that if we can't get that right on that, what are we expecting to happen on climate? And I think civil society will be pushing very much for a just transition. No one gets left behind, and that doesn't mean just workers, it also means no country gets left behind, giving a greater emphasis on adaptation, resilience, the inclusion of nature. So in conclusion, if you're looking at business, government, investors, and civil society at an international level, having an influence on the climate debate, this is also going to affect India. So my main message to you is we need collaboration. India and the world needs to collaborate together. Business, government, investors, civil society need to work together. And we are there to play our role by uniting forward-looking businesses in supporting policy and society to getting to halving emissions by 2030. And we've called that in our campaign, All In for 2030. So we look forward to working with TERI and other partners and companies and governments on this call to make that happen. Thank you.
Thank you, Sophie. Thank you very much for your perspective on what might be needed for India to move towards the net zero scenario. You did talk about, you discounted the possibility of or a very large use of offsets as a policy instrument for this purpose. And I fully agree with you, because carbon credits or offsets are currently they don't play a very great role when you begin or embark on a policy of net zero in the long term. What you said, in setting or the corporate's own desire to move towards a low carbon, setting a decarbonized system, that is critical, and whatever is needed for that we need to put in place. But let me, before I invite Shirish, on the issue of financing, the coal financing, which you pointed out, I think this was one of the sticking points in the G20 meeting, which happened last week. So I don't know if we can really use this as a policy instrument at the global level to really push countries towards net zero. I think there are better imaginative policy instruments available, and maybe we'll need more discussion on this. thank you very much for your perspective from Women Business once again. Let me now go over to Shirish, and Shirish doesn't need an introduction. He is currently the head of the Children's Investment Fund Foundation in India, and he is one of the he's a part of the civil society and the think tanks in India. So Shirish, over to you for your perspective on this.
Thank you, Mr. Rashmi, and I'll try to be as brief as possible to make up for some time. And thanks to TERI for organizing this webinar and inviting me to the session. So quick reflection on two things. One, on the study from the TERI and Shell. I think the scenarios of direct electrification and fuel switching to green hydrogen, together with the role of energy efficiency and material circularity, are, I think, exactly the right pillars that which we are working now with TERI on this new grant on industrial decarbonization. So I think we very much believe that those scenarios can work and can accelerate the decarbonization. And just like Ita had essentially expressed, my key concern again is on the emphasis on role of bioenergy and biofuels, especially because of the demand for the land that is needed and the conflict that it may lead to with food security. So I think that scenario and option needs to be debated and needs to be analyzed a little further and unpacked a little further. But coming to the next point, more listening to the industry champions at the beginning and to the speakers that are coming now to speak after me, as a foundation which has been kind of driving globally the energy transition agenda as well as in India, I think we believe there are 4 things have to be aligned from industry leadership to happen. And the one is that the championship on the championing of the climate action by the industry is essentially very essential and needed to exceed, not just achieve, but also exceed the 2030 plans. Therefore, listening to the speakers earlier, it was very heartening to see the sense of urgency that was expressed by the industry leaders, and then the need to shift the focus more towards on how to achieve that action or the net zero vision. And I think moving on that how parameter would be very much important. On the second point I just wanted to make was that our experience shows that at present, most of the investors and financial institutions are satisfied if the companies have set a targets or a long-term climate mitigation goals. What we strongly believe is that there is a need to shift that agenda and make the companies and even the financial institutions and banks to have in place a short-term or a 5-year clear climate action plans, which are actually implementable action plans and not just look at targets alone. Only then we will be able to achieve the targets. So therefore, having those clear short-term action plan is going to be important. At present, only few companies globally and in India, so this is not an unusual scenario for India, which actually have plans, but this should basically, we believe, need to become now a new norm, and that would require therefore educating the investors, the board, and the management. So last month, our board has approved a new investment in India, which will actually look at building capacities of Indian companies and financial institutions on short-term climate action plan. And this work will be led by CII. So I think one of the suggestions was, how do we bring the industry charter and CII closer? This could be one way that we can bring this work together. The other point is important, it would be for the transparency around the disclosures. And I think we need strong accountability mechanism, both for corporates and investors with respect to their emission reduction plans and targets, and also the performance of their climate action plan. So the most interesting development is that in India, we now have a mandatory disclosure by SEBI, which requires that the top 1,000 companies need to make those disclosure. But I think it is the kind of the disclosure that the companies are making and how we making them more accountable is going to be important. So we need to further strengthen the work around the climate leadership and action in that mandatory requirement. Finally, what I just want to say that the charter as a platform to drive the advocacy, which was expressed earlier, for framing the policies for net zero as well as around just transition is going to become more and more important. And I think we are extremely excited with the mandate and the vision of the charter. And we are glad that this new collaboration that I earlier talked about with TERI on industrial decarbonization will be further funding and strengthening this industry charter and to build the momentum towards not just near zero, but actually net zero sectoral transition plan. So with this, Mr. Rashmi, let me pause here and I look forward to the rest of the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Shirish, and thank you for being precise with your thoughts. And the one important point which emerges from your intervention is that there is a need for a strong accountability measure at the corporate level for us to really push this entire debate on the net zero towards something which can actually happen on the ground with corporates' own resources and their own decision-making processes. So it's important for them to internalize this in their decision-making process. Thank you very much for pointing it out. Let me now go over to the corporate leaders. There are 6 of them, and in fact, we have spent about 40 minutes laying out the perspectives, and so we have to now hear from them as to how they look at this whole business. 3 of them have already addressed you, so I'm sure they will be much brief and much more concise when they address you. So let me begin with Siemens first. Mr. Gerd Dusen is here with us. Dussels, I'm sorry. He is currently the head of the power and gas, the Siemens Limited, with very, very large, wide-ranging experience in India. So it will be extremely important for us to hear his perspective on the net zero scenario for India. Mr. Dussel, over to you.
You're mute.
Is he available?
Oh, can you hear me now? Sorry. Yeah.
Yes. Yes.
I was too much listening to all of you.
Okay. Yes, we can hear you now.
Yeah. Thank you very much for inviting me and organizing this session. And I have to say, a lot of topics were addressed and put on the table, and we all understand the need. But let me try to frame it a little bit more from a practical perspective. And I'm trying to use only 3-4 minutes. You know, from an industry or from a MNC perspective, from Siemens perspective, in India, we need to come now from words to actions. That is something which is you know, still very slow. And I see 2 elements. I see the supply side, and I see the demand side. And for both, the hydrogen roadmap of India is a fantastic starting point. We now have a roadmap in place. We have it, you know, in the budget. We have a clear vision what we want to do. But how can we come from words to action? And when I look at the supply side, I'll see companies like Dalmia on the industry side. They basically go ahead and implement already measures in the cement industry, which are benchmark. When I look at the MNCs in India, Adani and NTPCs, they not only announced, they announced major investments, but they are really going ahead and start implementing electrolyzer technology. They are planning to build PV panels. They are planning to build storage, battery storage, and so on. So I think on the supply side, we are good underway. We have started with a good setup, and even also the government is supplying a lot with Make in India, as we heard earlier, the PLI scheme. It really addresses the points, and we would be able to deliver the needed technology or the needed projects in all the sectors we just mentioned. And as a company, as Siemens, we are a technology provider. We are, of course, there to provide all these technologies, also give you know, advisory services, and we are having a decarbonized solution portfolio for advisory and for products out there, which I think can address, as others can do that as well, all these topics. But now coming to the demand side, and I think this is a topic which will really make or break or will make it happen, because someone has to use that hydrogen. Someone has to, you know, reduce that CO2. And as we have in India, no CO2, or the CO2 has no value. In other economies, it has a value. Then things go a little bit by itself. But in India, we don't have a value for the CO2. That's why we need, you know, somehow to think about how do we capture the different costs between let's say, a hydrogen production today of green hydrogen versus black hydrogen. And I think here, I would see some elements which I see on the policy side very well. The blending mechanism which are addressed, which will basically focus on you have to do it, and you know, the cost follows second. Then I realized on the industrial side, the PAT schemes, PAT schemes, was in a similar range. It was working very well, and we are still continuing very well on that. So, is there, as a question, is there an opportunity to build on such a similar scheme also to come up with some stimulus from the demand side? Because if that is happening, then I believe we will in India also move faster. When I look at the domestic versus the international ambitions, then I also would like to say, I believe we should make it work in India, and then the world will also see that, and then we would be able to also support outside of India, because we have a lot of good ingredients. We have a lot of sun. We have a lot of good stuff. We still have the transportation issue from India to Europe or from India to Japan or wherever, where currently the demand side is very high, and we'll work on that. We should work on that. But I think the key, from my point of view, being a leader here in India, we should make it work in India, and we should look at the demand side a little bit more, because supply is already there and will follow. So with that, I try to conclude. Of course, I would like to speak a lot more, but we have a couple more speakers which come after me. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Diuza. Thank you very much. That was very precise and very focused. You have essentially talked about the role of technology providers like Siemens, that there is absolutely no problem. You can make the investments, you can set up the supply systems, as long as there is a demand for it. And you need policies, policy interventions, and clear stimulus for the demand to be created, so that we can move in this direction. Of course, that's I mean, simple to understand, but there is a lot of complexity behind this. When you look at the economy-wide level and you start making transitions. Now, let me thank you very much for this. Let me now go over to Mr. Amit Sharma, who is the Managing Director of Tata Consulting Engineers Limited, and he's heading one of the largest private sector engineering and project consultancy organizations. So I'm sure his perspective on this net zero scenario, coming from a business group of Tatas, will be extremely useful for us. Over to you, Mr. Sharma.
Rashmi, I think this is Mukundan speaking. I think he signed off, unless he's there. He sent his message. I think we can take his points for the deliberations and for noting.
Okay, Mr. Mukundan, would you like to come in, because you have to speak in any case at some point? So you're most welcome.
I'd like to come later. I think others should be given a chance. I think let them speak first. I can speak at the end.
Okay, all right. Thank you. Now then, let me go over to
speak at the end. Let others speak.
Mr. Mahendra Singh has also signed out, I believe, because I saw his message in the chat that he has to go for something else. So, Mr. Nitin Prasad, if you are still there, you are most welcome to join us and tell us about what.
Mr. Ravichandran Purushottam from Danfoss.
Okay, he's there. Okay, all right. Mr. Purushottam, yes, you're most welcome.
Thank you, sir, and good evening, everybody. I hope I'm audible.
Yes, you're clearly audible.
Okay, thank you. And thank you for inviting me to share my thoughts this afternoon. I will keep it pretty brief. I think from an energy decarbonization perspective, I think there's a lot has been said this afternoon. But when I look at where we are at this point in time, I think in the last 2 decades, we have made significant progress, especially on energy access to a large population. And I think government has also given a lot of importance to the renewable energy, which has actually helped us increase the mix of its share in the overall energy scenario of India. But when I look a little bit into the future, let's say 2030, and India needs to carve out a different path compared to many matured economies, because we are still not. Climate change has not peaked as far as India is concerned. We still have a lot of GDP to be created, economic wealth to be created. And I think when we look at the $5 trillion or the $7.5 trillion, I think firstly we need to have a separate path here. So I would come in and look at what I would call as India need to look at what I call as deep digital decarbonization. And why I say digital as an integral part of decarbonization is because digital is a resource liberating force and it can help us democratize some of the resource challenges that are there. And primarily, I would like to kind of look at in three buckets. I think firstly, we need to have a very strong leadership and an ambitious target. Whether we want to break it down into 2030 targets or 2040 targets, we really need a long-term planning with the right policy framework, and both at the government level, at the industry level, at the private sector level, even at the research institutions. It's very important to have some targets which are interlinked to the overall objective. I think it's critical for us, when we look at the sectors of growth that we want to create in the next 10, 15, 20 years, we really need to look at how do we actually take decarbonization into these sectors. And probably it has to carve out a different path of productivity or manufacturing. So I think that is very, very important from my perspective. Added to that, I think we need to look at decoupling energy demand to GDP. I think when we look at the energy productivity, we have done quite a lot in industries, especially with PAT 1 and PAT 2. But I think we need to take it deeper into the buildings, deeper into water, deeper into agriculture. While we have made remarkable progress on energy efficiency, we have really not looked at cities. I think cities are where 70% of the state GDPs are getting generated. And we need to ask our question, in terms of measurement, can we look at energy to GDP per city? Like we benchmark ease of doing business in states, we need to look at some kind of metrics where it actually incentivizes with both carrot and stick model in a city to go after certain targets. And that's where probably we can create much more healthier competition. We also need to look at how do we increase the use of renewables. And today renewables are a lot more standalone, and we need to look at how do we look at much more in increasing its usage. And then, of course, to me, water, food, and energy have a great nexus. And we need to look at how do we actually address this part as well from a leadership perspective and as well as from a target perspective. My second important topic that I want to bring up is the MSMEs. As we speak today, MSMEs are a very important part of India. And when you look at the non-agriculture economy, it almost is like 28% of the GDP is exports that are coming from MSMEs. And we already are hearing about the G20s imposing a cross-border tax on carbon. What we need to do really is to handhold the MSMEs and how do we actually get them on board on this journey. This is very, very important from an India perspective. Here, I think we need a couple of important things. We need innovation in finance. I think if MSMEs have to embrace this journey, finance is a very, very critical element in it. And there are new business models. I don't think technology is an issue for at least for now, at least. We need to look at cooling as a service. We need to look at energy efficiency as a service, air compressor as a service. There, I think we need to look at a lot more banks and NBFCs participation with fintech solutions, where that's again a digital option that we need to explore. So that's the second part. So getting on board the MSMEs is a very, very important part in this transformation. Then the last pillar that we need to focus is around the sector coupling. And when I talk about sector coupling, it might sound a little bit like a buzzword, but cooling and heating, water and energy, they are all really very closely connected to each other. And when you look at digitalization as an opportunity, we also need to look at how do we integrate renewables into these sectors where there's a good amount of sector coupling and really look at some amount of innovation using photovoltaic and actually disrupt the energy requirements in many of the applications. For example, even a simple dairy application where milk is collected in a farm village could be disrupted because there you have an electricity, there you have solar possibility, there you have hot water requirement, and then you have a cooling requirement, you have a heating requirement. So there's an awful lot that needs to be done. And this is where I talk about India-centric solutions are needed. And more importantly, I think we need to work a lot with the universities. That's very, very important, because that's where a lot of localization on technology and harmonization of these technologies to an Indian requirement needs to be developed actually. So just to summarize, I think from a national perspective, we need a very strong target setting and leadership. We need to get MSMEs on board, and we need to look at sector coupling as a very important part in this journey. So this is just from a holistic point of view. I just wanted to share my thoughts, and for paucity of time, I would stop here. But before I hand over, I just want to let you all know that we also need to build strong lighthouses. And lighthouses are real inspirational projects. And I think this is very important for us, because, we have a herd mentality also in India. If somebody has done it, a lot more people will follow. So that's something we need to really look at. How do we build lighthouses? And I think we have a lot of CEOs here. We can work together to build a few lighthouses. Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Thank you, Mr. Purushothaman. Extremely important and valid points, and they resonate very well with the strategy which will have to be adopted. You talked about digital transformation. I mean, the integration of the digital technologies with the emerging technologies. Absolutely a wonderful point. You talked about SMEs. I mean, one cannot agree more with you that while we talk about the rest of the industries, the big industries, if we leave out the SMEs, which provide the largest workforce in the country, which consume the energy perhaps much more intensively than anybody else, so we will not be able to solve the problem. So thank you very much for highlighting these niche corners of the net zero policy in India, and we certainly will need to take them into account. Thank you once again. Now, the next speaker today we have is Mr. Venu Nuguri from Hitachi ABB Power Products and Systems India Limited. He is the managing director, and he has extremely large experience in this area. So good to hear his point of view. Mr. Venu Nuguri, over to you.
Thank you, Mr. Rashmi, and good afternoon, or maybe we are approaching good evening, everybody. I hope all of you are keeping safe. Let me be very brief on this, as we are coming close to this thing. We are Hitachi ABB Power Grids, a global company, and basically we are the technology provider across the power value chain, right from the generation, transmission, distribution, and also to the consumption side. So we basically enable the energy transition. Our portfolio, whether it is product, system, services, software, enables the energy transitions. So when we are in this energy transition, so we are also looking into ourselves, what is that as a citizen, as a corporate citizen, we need to do that. So we looked at that, and together with our teams, we have come to a conclusion that, our own operations in India, we want to be carbon neutral. So we had this strategy, and then we announced this strategy also to the market, to the stakeholders, to our own board, that by 2030, we're talking about 2030, that we want to be carbon neutral in our own operations in India. So as one of the panelists was saying, the very few companies so far has announced, and we are very happy and proud that we are one among the very few companies who has taken a giant step that, announcing this carbon neutral strategy publicly, how we are doing that. So we have a very clear strategy on this, both short term, medium term, as well as the long term. As a short term, we want to achieve 100% fossil-free electricity consumption in our own operations. We have 16 manufacturing facilities. We have more than 5,000 employees, 16 manufacturing facilities, more than 50 project sites. So we said by end of this fiscal year, and 100% electricity consumption in all of our facilities is through fossil-free. That's the number one target we took it. And the second one is a medium term, where we would like to cut the carbon footprint in our own value chain. As you know, as many of you are electrical engineers, We use the SF6 gas in the circuit breaker, GIS, ultra high voltage circuit breakers, etc. And we come on that an alternative gas to the SF6 thing, which is very, very environment friendly, what we call as econics. And the third is a long term. That means we would like to impact society by working, helping the decarbonizing the industries, utilities, and also the data centers, which are power guzzlers kind of things in that. So that's how the plan we made, and we have a clear plan in each and every year until 2030. That means it's not that everything happens in 2030. We start from this year, 100% fossil free, and then we go step by step how we cut down the various things. In addition to that, we also taken several other initiatives. For example, 50% reduction in the waste generation, 25% reduction in the fresh water use over a 10-year period. That means every year we will be bringing down the fresh water uses in that. So that's exactly as a technology provider enabling this energy transition, we are taking the leading position to do how we want to do that. And then we are very happy to share this to many other industries, whoever wants to, really work together, and we want to share with that. So the last point before I go, what is the pathway to India net zero? So there are 2-3 major buckets. So we have our government of India has set a target of 450 gigawatt of renewable by 2030. It's a very ambitious target. It's a really great initiatives. But to do that, we need to do at least 4 to 5 times more than what we have been doing now. If you take a COVID effect of last year, we were doing 8 gigawatt we have added, but on average we are doing around 10 gigawatt or so. So to reach 450 gigawatt, we need to do at least 4 to 5 times, 40 to 50 gigawatt per year we need to do. So we need the speed of action. We need everything, speed from all the stakeholders, right, from the regulators and policy standpoint, everything we need to have so that we are able to achieve this thing. If you miss the 2030, we're really going to have a big catch up to do to reach our 2050 in that. So second, another panelist was talked about the cost associated with the green technologies. Absolutely, you're right. When we are investing the technologies, the cost could be higher. But our country, as we know that it's a most cost conscious country, affordability is the key in this country. Okay, while we need the technologies, while we need the more greener technologies, but at the same time it has to be affordable, and affordable means completely all the functional quality, everything meeting all the requirement at the same time with affordability. So we also, the good part is that the greener technologies also comes with the enabling digital technologies on top of it that. So looking at both CapEx and OpEx, if you really look at many of the customers, they want a lower CapEx, but they don't mind incurring the high OpEx for over a period of time in that. But if you're adding a CapEx and OpEx over a lifetime of 25 years and looking at these green technologies, which are enabled with the digital technology, and that can bring down the cost and it can be really make affordable from the beginning in that. And the third last point from my side is that, this is all evolving. Everybody is learning. Everybody is doing a lighthouse within own system. So it's extremely important that collaboration and co-creation, working together is the need of the hour. Sharing the practices. We have Hitachi ABB Power Grid in India. When we announced our thing, we are very happy to share our experience, our learning, how we are progressing on our carbon neutral strategy to the stakeholders in a periodic manner. So this is how the more and more companies do come forward, and then they create the really a framework to make this India a really net zero by 2050. Thank you, Mr. Rashmi, and thank you, TERI, and thank you for listening to me.
Thank you, Mr. Nuguri. It was absolutely fantastic. You talked about the lighthouses of the industry, and you were absolutely opposite of what, in a lighter vein, I must say that you were opposite of what Mr. Gerduser was saying. He was asking about demand side interventions first. You have talked about your own initiatives taken by the industry itself, how you can move towards net zero through your own actions. That was fantastic, tremendous. And these are good pointers about what can be done by the industry in terms of taking policy decisions board level decisions about moving towards a net zero. That is the first step. And then you talked about costs, how to make it affordable over a lifetime of the product. And this, of course, needs financing, good policy framework and financing support, because a lot of industries cannot do this unless there is a good financing support available for this purpose. Even consumers can't do this. So extremely valid points, and thank you very much for your perspective on this. Let me now go over to the last speaker, perhaps today, Mr. Vikram Gulati.
Good evening. Thank
you. Let me introduce you, Mr. Gulati. You are currently working as the country head of the senior vice president of the Toyota Kirloskar Motors, and as we know, Kirloskar is a household name in our country. They are the pioneers in certain technologies, and it will be extremely important to understand how they look at this whole business of transformation and transition in the country. Mr. Gulati, over to you.
Thank you. Sorry for jumping in. Perhaps it's got to do something with the fact that I'm last on the line.
You're most welcome.
So to begin, I would like to thank TERI.
Don't worry, Mr. Gulati. I'm still waiting. Okay, so I'll be the last person.
So at the outset, thank you for having us. This is really something very important. Representing an automobile manufacturer, we believe that the responsibility of automobile manufacturers is not only to produce vehicles which have zero emissions, but it goes much beyond that. We have to look at being responsible for the life cycle of the... am I audible?
Your voice is
okay, low. I'll just come closer. I think it's got something to do with the mic.
Yeah.
I hope I'm audible now.
Yes.
So yeah, I was basically saying, as an automobile manufacturer, we believe that companies such as such who manufacture vehicles have to look at our responsibility going well beyond just the vehicles that we manufacture, and those being zero carbon emitting vehicles, and look at ourselves as being responsible for the entire life cycle of the products that we produce. So that responsibility is not only on the vehicles, but how we manufacture and how we reduce our own carbon, as well as how we reduce the carbon from the stage of raw material extraction to the end of life of the vehicle. Now, in 2015, Toyota took Environment Challenge 2050 targets. 3 of these targets were based on zero carbon emissions. So we've committed that we'll achieve zero carbon emissions in manufacturing, in the vehicles we sell, and for the life cycle of the vehicles that we will produce. In addition, we also have a target of minimizing the water use. Now, this is a challenge we took way back 6 years ago in 2015, and we've been continuously working towards it. As an affiliate of Toyota in India, we're happy to share that we've made very good progress in some of these challenges. For instance, on the manufacturing side, we're very close to net zero carbon manufacturing. We've done a lot of work on energy efficiency and utilizing a lot of renewable energy. Our utilization of renewable energy is to the extent of 95% today. Similarly, on water recycling, our dependence on outside water is just mere 4%. And this is accompanied by a lot of afforestation. Now, that's a bit about what we've done. Now, let me come to the core issue about the vehicles that we manufacture. And a lot is being talked about, moving towards electrification. We believe that this technological shift is definitely one of the key enablers towards reducing or eliminating carbon emissions. But we must look at the unique position that India is in terms of affordability of vehicles, the per capita income, the lack of local ecosystem for manufacturing of electric vehicle parts, as well as the infrastructure. Now, all these are enablers for rapid electrification. So based upon these factors, the latest BNEF EV sales projections that came in last month basically says that as far as India is concerned, we will have very rapid and faster and large electrification shift to EVs in 2-wheelers and 3-wheelers. But as far as other segments go, particularly the commercial vehicles, the large commercial vehicles, interstate buses, and passenger cars, this is definitely going to be much more challenging and slower. From the passenger vehicle segment that I represent, by 2025, they predict the sales would be around 55,000 units per year. That's around 1.5% market share, and to reaching around 8% market share by 2030. Now, clearly, that is not enough if we are to achieve anything close to zero carbon even by 2040, because we have to keep in mind the millions of vehicles that we put on road today have a life of 15 odd years, and these vehicles are going to be around, if you sell a vehicle today, it's going to be there till 2035, unless of course other regulations come in. So looking at that, I think what we really need to do is focus on how we can steepen this curve for EV adoption. One of the key factors, like I mentioned, is affordability. Linked to it is the requirement for mass scale manufacturing in India. Therefore, as Toyota, we are committed to mass electrification with localization, because we believe that's a sustainable approach to achieving large scale electrification. Going forward, even if we were to achieve a much higher, steeper electrification of vehicles, what we see is that there is going to be residual ICE vehicles in very large numbers going forward, and those are going to have an impact. For instance, as per the latest IEA India Energy Forecast 2021, the forecast says while the energy intensity of our economy comes down significantly, the carbon emissions actually increased by 50%. And a lot of this has got to do with industry sector and the transportation sector. For instance, there's going to be a very sharp increase in carbon from freight operations and also cars. Cars, it is expected it's going to quadruple. So what we really need to do is look at a multi-pronged approach right now. So we can't wait for, a very just one technology approach right now. We have to build up that particular shift going forward. Therefore, we have to look at means as a macro strategy point of view, from substituting the fossil fuels. Ethanol blending is coming in big way right now. We believe in the current format, it does provide significant means of having a sustainable approach towards tackling the fuel consumption that is there in terms of short term. Of course, there are issues around that, which speakers before me spoke about. There is also very high need to shift towards mass and shared mobility. Shared mobility, of course, has taken a bit of a hit with COVID. We have to see how we get back to it. A company such as us, we are already looking at ourselves as mobility service providers rather than mere automobile manufacturers. The other bit, I think, which is a very big area where we can improve, is significantly increase the efficiency of current set of technologies, as this kind of intervention is not so challenging as some other technological interventions. Now, if you combine efficiency improvements along with substitution, let's say what Brazil follows, for example, ethanol strong hybrid, then you suddenly have a multiplication of the positive impacts. Of course, the long term really is to shift towards all of these electrified technologies, particularly electric and hydrogen. Going forward, we see all the technologies in the electrified vehicle space, which includes strong hybrids, plug-ins, BEVs, as well as hydrogen, are going to have a play in their own areas, depending upon the needs of the consumer in terms of size of the vehicle and distance traveled. We have to today really decarbonize the energy generation in India. Currently, electricity in India is predominantly coal-based. Our carbon intensity of electricity is 725 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt, as against 510 odd for the world average. This really makes a shift to electric on a well-to-wheel basis not a positive shift on a carbon perspective, because when you factor in the carbon emissions on generation and transmission side, that takes away all the benefits that you drive on the tailpipe end. So this is another area that we really have to work at, and that 450 gigawatt target that the country is looking at from solar and wind and renewables is something that will definitely help bring down the total well-to-wheel carbon intensity of electric vehicles going forward. And therefore, that is something that is critical. Now, from a policy perspective, I'll quickly come to this. We believe learning from what others have done, where they've succeeded and where they have not done so well. Globally, what we see is there is one policy lever which has been very effective. Even countries are adopting it in the neighborhood, like Thailand, etc. That is linking vehicle taxation, the GST, road tax, etc., to the desired outcome of carbon emission. So if you have taxation linked to size of the vehicle and the carbon it emits, it sets the tone and the direction and the economic incentive for OEMs, for companies who manufacture vehicles, to strive towards achieving lower carbon emissions by various technological means, which can be all synergic. This would be very much complementary to the CAFE regime, the corporate average fuel efficiency norms, and has been seen as having a multiplier effect. Now, one thing that we've seen in Japan, the cumulative number of vehicles has gone up steadily over the years. However, the fossil fuel consumption has come down. And partly this is due to this kind of a technology neutral and national and objective desired goal linked policies that they've kind of implemented. Of course, hydrogen is a big opportunity for India. We believe there are tremendous opportunities of reducing costs on the operating side for green hydrogen. And if you synergize with the huge possibilities of usage on the demand side from industry, we see that transportation has a huge potential for this space also.
Mr. Gulati, I think we will have to...
just winding up, going forward, I'll just like to reiterate our commitment to achieving the global goals of zero carbon by 2050 on a life cycle basis from an India perspective also. Thank you for giving me a patient hearing. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Gulati, very much. And your perspective was extremely useful. You made 3 or 4 very major points. You said some of the key things which are important for us to move towards a net zero goal. One would be, particularly in the mobility sector, one is the issue of affordability, how you achieve affordable vehicles. Second is the mass scale manufacturing, which will, of course, help reduce the costs. Ethanol, introduction of ethanol and ethanol production, both on a normative basis and also on the production side. And then, of course, the societal and the behavioral norms like shared mobility, and of course, you need industrial and business innovations also for that purpose. So 3-4 things which are critical for us to make the mobility sector carbon neutral, to move towards electric mobility. And one very important point which he made was that the first the leaders in this segment will be the 2- and 3-wheelers, not the passenger cars or the commercial vehicles. So it's important for our the policy planners. I'm sure Rupa is listening. The people who plan the policies, they need to look at those segments, MSMEs, or the people who produce vehicles for those segments of people who consume large. I mean, their consumption is extremely large. And so we address the equity aspect as well when we address the net zero scenario in the long term. So very good, and thank you very much, Mr. Gulati, for making these useful points. We have already overshot our time by a significant margin, but I cannot resist the temptation of inviting Mr. Mukundan to address us once again and tell us what he thinks from the perspective of Tata's, and also his own personal perspective as to what is it that needs to be done. Over to you, Mr.
Rashmi, thank you so much. I'm not going to come from Tata's perspective. I'm going to stick to what TERI and TERI CBS must do. As a co-chair, I want to first thank all of you for organizing this wonderful session. So compliments to the team. It was very educative. Unfortunate, some of my colleagues had to sign off because of prior commitment, but I decided to stay on. I've postponed my meetings and I just for Girish's benefit, because he's going to come next to say what is the way forward. I just had 4 or 5 points which Girish could note down and to sort of work forward. And I think we need to look at this in 3 buckets, which is resource, which includes climate finance, structure, and transition. I think we need to put that in terms of resource. I think when you look from government perspective, it is not just climate finance. When you decarbonize power sector, you need to move away from coal. It's going to cost a lot of money. I think no one's put a number to that and got a fixed understanding of, and coal is going to be a bad word. And I think government needs to, helping government to transition is going to be critical. Second is the revenue loss from oil and gas. I think it's about 15% of India's revenue today, government's revenue comes from there. And how are we going to help government transition? And what are the other revenue models? On top of that, you've got to help and support and fund the transition process. So I think this resource issue needs to be understood, and we need to understand whether it's 100 billion, 170 billion, is it a 200 billion? Because I'm hearing all sorts of numbers. I think we need to get our arms around it. It's a big issue. Second is structural. In structural, I think one big issue we need to bell the cat in the short term is the power sector reform. We've had so many schemes go out, but the state electricity boards and distribution still remains a key bottleneck in this transition. If we don't address the elephant in the room, this entire transition 2030 and all those issues will get delayed. I think we need to impress upon policymakers. They need to address this. Other than that, I think government has moved very well on several issues like International Solar Alliance. I think working on a hydrogen infrastructure. I fully agree with the comment which has been made. This is on the transition pathway. Biofuel cannot be at the expense of food, and we need to look at marine biofuel. And I think that whole scheme which the government of India announced through the finance bill this time in terms of looking at marine resource, I think we need to look at that. The issue which I think we also need to bring into play, which has been highlighted by many speakers, demand side management. But in that, I think the key buckets which we need to look at is agriculture, MSME, and bottom of the pyramid consumers. How are we going to help them? These are my only comments. Girish, I don't know whether it helps you in your approach way forward, but these are big asks from everybody. India is going to be under severe pressure in COP26, I can tell you. While countries will want to sign up with India, but I think India may be India needs to put its best foot forward with respect to the resource issue and especially on the climate finance issue. And we need to speak with one voice when we go there. I hope we reach that one voice with the help of institutions like TERI, and whatever CBS needs to do, we will do, Girish, to support you. Thank you so much for organizing this, and Rashmi, compliments to you. And Dr. Dhawan and to Girish for putting it all together along with the entire team at TERI. Really wonderful, enjoyed the session.
Thank you, Mr. Mukundan. We have come to the end of this panel discussion, and we have had very extremely insightful perspectives, and we have learned a number of things from the corporate leaders. Some of them are new, some of them are known, but helping them put together will certainly help us clarify our thoughts a little bit, both in the area of domestic policy making and our global positioning. At the global level, of course, things will take their own, government will take its own position. There are different kind of dynamics plays out there, but I think we need to be focused on a domestic scenario for net zero. And what kind of policy interventions, what kind of business innovations are required, that is something which we need to focus at. Most of the, to the Mr. Mukundan's point about $100 billion or $150 billion, I think what is important to understand is that 80% of the resources for meeting climate goals are currently mobilized domestically. Very little comes from international sources. So ultimately, the entire corporate, the industry, and the government will have to look at the domestic sources of finance and gear up gird up its law and provide the resources for moving along this net zero path. Thank you very much to all the panelists for making their contributions, and over to you, Girish, for winding up. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Rashmi. I think first of all, I should thank you, Mr. Rashmi, I think for moderating this session so well. I think we started late and we are, but I think the point is, I think all the panelists made wonderful comments, I think, and also many of the panelists, I think, from the industry side, outlined what exactly they are doing in their own companies, which let me also be very frank that I was also not aware in some of the cases. Like, for example, in case of Toyota, I think I remember the earlier discussion with Mr. Gulati a few weeks back where he mentioned about how much effort, how much of renewable energy they themselves are using in their own plants. But I think it's very important, these kind of discussions are important for the industry, corporate leaders and others to really share also with each other how much they are doing, and that will also probably help others to really join in this whole movement for a net zero and moving forward. Thanks, Mr. Mukundan, I think, for putting these 4 or 5 points. We will deliberate internally how we want to take this up. Within that, we'll have discussions with Mr. Rashmi. And also, I think this whole point on the power sector, which you mentioned about the structural reform, the distribution sector, we have a full-fledged team working under the guidance of Mr. A.K. Saxena. So we'll be working, see how we can take these discussions forward and try to contribute in this whole discussion. Let me also mention that as a part of this industry charter, which Mr. Mukundan, you along with a couple of 4 or 5 of your colleagues really were the initial signatories. We would like to see that we organize these kind of discussions more frequently and maybe deep dive into some of those specific subjects which came up in the real, I would say, at the top level. For example, hydrogen is one issue which has been coming up again and again. Then this whole issue of transport sector. So we would like to see that these discussions happen amongst players who are interested in those subjects, and we will be coming out with such seminars, and we'd like to seek your advice on how to take these discussions forward as well. One, of course, is the research agenda, which will guide us in TERI in the work which we do. But we would like to see that the CEOs, and there are many other players. I saw actually the interest on the subject. At the peak of this time, we had almost close to 200 participants there, and even now also we have close to around 80 people when we are almost at the closing stage. So thanks everybody who has stayed on, and we'll be more, I would say, judicious in our time management next time when we have such a session. And thanks specifically to Mr. Mukundan, I think, for staying on for so long. You have postponed your other meetings. And I would also like to take this opportunity to thank specifically Ms. Rupa Datta, I think, if she's still around, for joining. I think she mentioned this was the first, this is a new portfolio, but I think engagement with her department will be very crucial as we move forward. And of course, working with the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change. And finally, I would also like to put a word of thanks for our partners, the Women Business, ETC, and SIF, who have been our constant support for many, many years now. So thanks everybody, and sincere apologies for keeping you extra for almost 1 hour, I think, exactly 6 o'clock now. So we were planning to close it at 5 o'clock. So thank you, everybody.
Thank you, Girish. Thank you, sir.